Jamila Green stepped into the courtroom, her heart beating a little faster than usual. It was her first time standing before a judge since becoming an active participant in movements advocating for women's rights. Dressed in a simple blouse and slacks, she tried to keep her nerves in check. Today wasn't just about her. It was about something much bigger. The courtroom was relatively quiet as the judge called her name. Jamila rose to her feet, standing tall despite the weight of the situation. Judge John Richardson, known for his firm, conservative views, sat at the bench with a stern expression. His reputation was built on a no-nonsense approach to law and order, especially when it came to protests and public disturbances. Jamila had been part of a peaceful demonstration held just a few days ago outside the courthouse, advocating for the protection of reproductive rights. The protest had been largely peaceful, but the traffic had been disrupted, and a few loud voices had drawn attention. Jamila knew that the protest, although minor in terms of public disturbance, was about to cost her. The tension in the room was thick as she approached the judge's desk. She could feel the eyes of the small crowd on her, some supporters, some detractors. The judge, who hadn't hidden his distaste for such activism, adjusted his glasses and peered at Jamila over the top of his reading glasses. "You were involved in this demonstration, correct?" Judge Richardson's voice was firm, his gaze fixed on her with what felt like judgment, even though he hadn't spoken yet. "Yes, Your Honor," Jamila replied, her voice steady but measured. She was prepared to explain her actions, but she wasn't sure the judge would be willing to listen. "I've reviewed the reports. This protest disrupted the normal functioning of this courthouse and caused unnecessary inconvenience to the public. I find such behavior unacceptable," he continued, his words deliberate. Jamila felt her pulse quicken, but she didn't break her gaze. This was her moment to stand for what she believed in. "I was there to stand up for something bigger than myself," Jamila said calmly. "Reproductive rights are a fundamental part of healthcare, and we are not just fighting for our own freedom. We're fighting for the freedom of every woman, especially those who don't have a voice." Judge Richardson's eyes narrowed. He didn't seem moved by her words, his stance still unyielding. "Your actions, however, are disruptive, and the law is clear. You will be fined for your involvement. I trust this will send a message to others who think they can simply break the rules for a cause." The gavel came down with a loud bang, sealing her fate. Jamila felt a knot tighten in her stomach as the word sunk in. A fine. It wasn't the worst thing that could happen, but it was a reminder of how difficult the road ahead would be. She knew this fine would not deter her. Instead, it would fuel her drive to continue pushing for what she knew was right, no matter the cost. As she turned to leave the courtroom, her mind raced with thoughts of the larger fight. This wasn't just about her. It was about all the women who had yet to find their voice. The fine may have been the beginning of her confrontation with the law, but Jamila Green was prepared for the long road ahead. And Judge Richardson, for all his authority, had just made a mistake he would soon come to regret. Jamila Green wasn't always the outspoken activist the town had come to recognize. In fact, her journey into advocacy had begun quietly, rooted in personal experience rather than political ambition. Growing up in the same small town, she had always been keenly aware of the challenges faced by women, particularly Black women, when it came to healthcare. Jamila had watched her mother, a hardworking single parent, struggle with health issues while navigating a system that was often indifferent to the needs of people like her. These early experiences planted a seed in Jamila's heart, one that would grow over the years into a passionate desire to ensure that all women, especially those in marginalized communities, had access to the health care they needed and deserved. After graduating high school, Jamila went on to become a nurse, a profession that not only allowed her to help people directly but also gave her a deeper understanding of the medical system and its shortcomings. She spent years working in hospitals, clinics, and public health settings, where she saw the systemic challenges women faced, particularly when it came to reproductive care. Jamila knew that women in her community, often underserved, underrepresented, and overlooked, needed a voice in the fight for their rights. It wasn't long before Jamala's quiet dedication to helping others evolved into activism. What began with simple conversations at community meetings grew into a more organized effort. She began volunteering with organizations focused on reproductive rights, healthcare access, and women's equality. As she learned more about the systemic issues at play, ranging from limited access to reproductive health services to the growing threats to federal protections, she realized her activism needed to be louder, more visible. She had become part of national movements, working alongside organizations that were striving to protect women's autonomy over their own bodies, including access to safe and legal abortion. But despite her increasing involvement in larger causes, Jamala never lost sight of the needs of her community. She still worked as a nurse, still volunteered at local clinics, and still advocated for the women in her neighborhood. She wasn't just a face in the crowd. She was someone who understood the intimate, everyday struggles of the people she was fighting for. Her activism wasn't just about policy. It was about the women she cared for, the women she knew by name, whose lives were directly impacted by the decisions being made in boardrooms and courtrooms far away. Jamala's fight for reproductive rights was personal. It wasn't just a political cause to her. It was a moral one. As a mother, a nurse, and a woman, she understood that access to reproductive health care was essential to a woman's dignity, autonomy, and future. That was why she found herself at that protest, standing up for what she believed in, even though it meant facing the consequences of a judge who didn't understand her mission. In the weeks that followed the fine, Jamala would find herself not only fighting against the system, but also for the system that would ensure her voice, and the voices of countless others, would never be silenced. The news of Jamala's fine spread quickly through the town, sparking debates in homes, coffee shops, and workplaces. People were divided. Some praised Judge Richardson for upholding the law, while others criticized him for penalizing a woman who was simply fighting for her beliefs. Jamala's name became a hot topic, both locally and on social media, where opinions swirled in every direction. The protest that had seemed like just another event in a long history of activism was now at the center of a community-wide storm. For Jamala, the fine was not just an inconvenience. It was a symbol of the larger battle she was waging. While her supporters rallied around her, others saw her actions as an attempt to disrupt the order of things. To many, Jamala's cause was one that had no place in their small, traditional town, where conservative values ran deep. They didn't understand her passion or her purpose, and for some, it seemed easier to dismiss her as a troublemaker than to acknowledge the real issues she was trying to address. As the days passed, more media outlets picked up the story, with news crews descending on the town to interview locals about the fine. Jamala became an unintentional figurehead for the debate over reproductive rights, a cause that had become increasingly contentious across the country. She was asked to give interviews, participate in panel discussions, and speak at rallies. Jamala never hesitated. She knew this was her moment to amplify her message, and she wasn't going to back down because of a fine or public criticism. In one interview, she shared her reasons for protesting. "This isn't just about me standing here today. This is about every woman who has ever been denied access to the care she needs. This is about making sure that every woman has the right to make decisions about her own body, regardless of her race, class, or background. We cannot let our rights be taken away, not by anyone." Her words resonated with some, especially those who had felt the sting of being overlooked by a system that was supposed to serve them. Jamala's supporters, many of whom had been on the front lines of previous protests, pushed back hard against the fine, launching petitions, organizing marches, and speaking out at town meetings. They demanded accountability, not only for the fine but for the broader implications of a judge who, in their eyes, had misunderstood the very essence of the protest. But as the public outcry grew, Jamala knew that she was walking a fine line. For every person who stood with her, there were just as many who saw her as a threat to the town's values. Her activism was making waves, and while that meant raising awareness, it also meant that tensions were rising, both in the community and within herself. Jamila had expected resistance, but the magnitude of it was starting to weigh heavily on her. And all the while, Judge Richardson, sitting in his office behind closed doors, was watching, listening, and wondering whether his decision had been the right one. The fine he had imposed on Jamila might have been a legal ruling, but something inside him was starting to shift. What Judge Richardson didn't realize when he handed down the fine was just how deeply Jamila's activism had already reached beyond their small town. As the media frenzy surrounding the protest and the fine intensified, journalists began digging into Jamila's background, revealing a side of her the judge had never known. What he had initially seen as a local protester was, in fact, a dedicated advocate working with national organizations that supported women's reproductive rights and healthcare access. Jamila's story, when told in full, was one of commitment and service, not rebellion. She had been involved with several well-established groups that worked on the front lines of reproductive justice, including providing education on contraception, funding for women's health services, and advocating for laws that protected the right to choose. Her work wasn't limited to her town or even her state. It was part of a broader movement aimed at ensuring women across the country could make decisions about their bodies without fear of legal or financial barriers. Her voice had been a beacon for those who felt unheard, and she had spent countless hours supporting women who faced barriers to accessing safe health care. This new information began to change the way people saw Jamila. What was once viewed as a minor act of defiance in a small town now seemed like part of a much larger and more critical movement. Jamila's influence stretched far beyond the courthouse steps. She was more than a protester. She was a woman with a mission, someone who believed that the fight for reproductive rights was a fight for every woman's dignity and autonomy. When the news outlets started covering her background, including her work with clinics that provided reproductive health services, even the most skeptical members of the community began to take notice. Some residents who had previously viewed her as nothing more than an outsider or troublemaker found themselves questioning their assumptions. The narrative that had painted Jamila as a simple protester was being replaced with one that acknowledged her as a woman of integrity, committed to fighting for the well-being of women who had few other advocates. For Judge Richardson, the revelation was jarring. He had seen Jamila's protest as an isolated act, a disruption that needed to be curtailed. But as he learned more about her work, he found himself unsettled. Jamila wasn't just fighting for a cause she believed in. She was fighting for people like the women he sought every day in his courtroom, women who faced tough decisions with little support. The personal stories of struggle, determination, and resilience he heard about Jamila's work began to eat away at the assumptions he had made. As the stories of Jamila's advocacy spread, some of the more vocal critics of the fine began to question whether it was fair or just to punish someone for championing the rights of women. Even those who disagreed with her cause started to wonder if they had been too quick to judge. For the first time, Judge Richardson began to see Jamila not as a figurehead of political unrest, but as a woman who had earned her place in the conversation about women's rights, no longer just a protester, but an important voice in an ongoing nationwide struggle. Judge Richardson had been a man of certainty, someone who had always trusted his decisions and believed in the clear-cut nature of the law. But over the past few days, something had shifted within him. As the media coverage of Jamila's fine continued to flood the airwaves, he found himself replaying his decision again and again. At first, he had been resolute, convinced that his ruling was justified. After all, the law was the law, and Jamila's protest had disrupted the order of the courthouse. She had broken the rules, and in his eyes, there should be consequences. But now, sitting alone in his office late one evening, Richardson found himself questioning the simplicity of that reasoning. The more he thought about it, the more he wondered if there was more to Jamila's actions than he had initially seen. The media had painted a picture of her as a fighter for justice, a voice for women who had long been denied basic rights. The protests, the rallies, the interviews, he saw them as disruptions at first, but now he wasn't so sure. What troubled him most were the stories he had heard about Jamila's work. She wasn't a career protester. She was a nurse, a community member, a mother. She wasn't just speaking out for the sake of protest. She was speaking out because, to her, reproductive rights were not abstract political issues. They were about real people, real women, and the fundamental right to choose. Richardson had heard the stories of women who had been denied health care, women who had been forced to make impossible decisions because they lacked access to services. Jamila's efforts to support those women had become her life's work. And yet, Richardson still didn't fully understand it. He had always been someone who valued order, who believed in the legal system's ability to maintain that order. But Jamila had made him question whether true justice could be found in merely following the rules. Was it possible that the very law he had been upholding might itself be an obstacle to fairness? He thought back to his own experiences as a judge. There had been cases, over the years, where he had struggled with the black and white nature of the law. It wasn't always so clear what was right or wrong, and sometimes the law didn't fully account for the complexities of a person's situation. Was Jamila's protest such an instance? Was there something deeper at play that he had missed in his rush to punish? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone ringing. It was his wife, Susan. She could tell something was bothering him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like sharing his doubts. As he spoke to her about Jamila's background and the stories he had heard, he realized just how conflicted he truly was. He wasn't sure what the right answer was anymore. For the first time in a long time, Judge Richardson began to wonder if he had made a mistake, and if so, what would he do about it? The pressure on Judge Richardson to address the controversy surrounding Jamila's fine had become impossible to ignore. The media continued to cover the story, and the town's residents, both supportive and critical, seemed to be growing more vocal by the day. It was no longer just a matter of a fine. It had evolved into a broader conversation about justice, reproductive rights, and whether the law was being applied fairly in this case. Jamila had become a figurehead in a national conversation, one that was far bigger than the small courthouse where it had all started. It was during this time that the local community organized a town hall meeting, inviting both Jamila and Judge Richardson to discuss the fine and, more importantly, the issues at the heart of the protest. The idea was to create an open forum where both sides could express their views, ideally fostering a deeper understanding. At first, Richardson wasn't sure what to expect. He had never been one for public debates, preferring to keep his judgments and decisions private. But the mounting pressure made it clear that this was a conversation that had to happen. Jamila, on the other hand, welcomed the opportunity. She had spent the last few weeks explaining her cause to anyone who would listen. But now, facing the man who would find her, she saw this as a chance to directly address the source of the conflict. It was a rare moment, one where both sides of the argument could meet in the same room, not just as individuals with opposing views, but as human beings. The town hall meeting was held in the community center, a large room filled with chairs that were quickly taken by a packed audience. People stood in the back, eager to hear what the judge and the activist would say. When Jamila entered, she was greeted with quiet applause from some corners of the room, while others sat in stony silence. Richardson, walking in a few minutes later, was met with the opposite, cold, distant stares from those who were angry at his decision. As the meeting began, the moderator introduced both Jamila and the judge. The audience fell silent, waiting to hear what they would say. Richardson, with his stern face, opened the conversation, speaking about his duty as a judge to uphold the law. He acknowledged that there was a lot of public attention surrounding the case, but he stood by his decision. He believed in maintaining order in the courtroom and preventing any form of disruption. Jamila listened carefully, her arms crossed over her chest, her gaze focused on him. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't focus on the fine or the protest itself. Instead, she spoke of the larger issue, the reality of women who were being denied the right to make choices about their own bodies. "This isn't about me," she said softly but firmly. "It's about the women who will never make it into your courtroom because they're afraid to ask for the care they need. It's about giving people the freedom to choose their own futures." There was a pause. Judge Richardson sat back in his chair, his hands folded. He looked at Jamila with a mixture of respect and uncertainty, his mind wrestling with the weight of her words. For the first time, he didn't see just a protester. He saw someone who truly believed in the importance of her cause, someone whose actions were born out of a deep commitment to justice. The crowd watched, holding their breath. The tension was palpable. The silence after Jamila's words hung in the air, heavy and thoughtful. Judge Richardson's mind churned as he processed the gravity of her statement. She hadn't come to the town hall just to defend herself or the protest. She had come to ask him, to ask all of them, to look beyond the fine, to look beyond the law, and think about the people affected by decisions made in courtrooms like his. It was a perspective he hadn't fully considered, and he could feel it shifting something inside him. The moderator, sensing the moment, gave the floor to the audience. Several hands shot up, eager to weigh in. Some were critical, questioning why Jamila had chosen to protest in such a public way when other avenues existed. Others spoke in support of her cause, urging Judge Richardson to reconsider his stance. But the most powerful voices were those of women in the room, women who had experienced firsthand the impact of restrictive healthcare policies, the kind Jamila was fighting against. One woman, her face lined with the weight of experience, stood up and shared her story. "I didn't have access to the healthcare I needed when I needed it most," she said, her voice wavering with emotion. "It was a nightmare to feel like my body wasn't my own, like the system was deciding my future. I know what Jamila is fighting for. And it's not just her fight. It's my fight too." Her words resonated deeply in the room. Jamila nodded, her expression one of solidarity, as the audience grew more and more engaged. Even Judge Richardson, who had entered the town hall with every intention of defending his ruling, could not deny the emotional weight of the stories being shared. The women in the room weren't abstract figures. They were real people with real experiences. They weren't just asking for access to health care. They were asking for dignity, for autonomy over their own bodies. As the evening progressed, Judge Richardson found himself no longer standing as a figure of authority, but as a person grappling with the responsibility of his position. He could feel the tension in the room, a mixture of frustration and hope, of people longing for justice. He was no longer just thinking about the law in the way he had been trained to. He was thinking about the lives of the people in front of him, the women whose futures could be shaped by policies and rulings made by judges like himself. When the conversation finally came to a close, Jamila took a deep breath and turned toward Judge Richardson. For the first time, he met her gaze, no longer filled with the certainty of a judge's command, but with the uncertainty of a man who had begun to reconsider his position. He could see it in her eyes. She wasn't here to blame him. She was here to ask him to be part of a solution. As the crowd began to disperse, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't an immediate resolution, but it was the beginning of something, an opening, a conversation that hadn't existed before. Jamila's presence had stirred something deeper within the judge, something that would force him to question the way he viewed his role as a judge and the impact of the decisions he made. For the first time in a long while, Judge Richardson was uncertain about what he should do next. But he knew one thing for sure. This conversation was far from over. The days following the town hall meeting were filled with a sense of quiet reflection. The tension in the community hadn't disappeared, but something had shifted. Jamila's message had resonated with many people, including Judge Richardson. It was no longer just about the fine. It had become about something far larger, the intersection of justice, rights, and the real-world consequences of legal decisions. Jamila, as she went about her daily life, could sense that the conversations were changing. In the weeks after the meeting, more people reached out to her. Some were hesitant at first, unsure of where they stood, but their views were beginning to soften. They appreciated her calm, unwavering stance, her belief that the fight wasn't just hers, but everyone's. She wasn't just an activist standing on a podium. She was a woman with a purpose. And people could see that. Even those who still disagreed with her were starting to see her as someone who cared about the real issues affecting the community. As for Judge Richardson, he spent many sleepless nights thinking about what had transpired. He had always prided himself on his impartiality, but now he found himself caught between the strict interpretation of the law and the human stories that had flooded his mind. He couldn't help but wonder whether his decision had been the right one. The fine he had imposed on Jamila was just a small piece of a much larger puzzle. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the law was not just a set of rules to be followed without question. It was meant to serve justice, to protect people, to uphold dignity. And Jamila's fight for reproductive rights, for women's autonomy, was rooted in these very principles. The turning point came when Judge Richardson made an unexpected visit to a local clinic where Jamila had volunteered for years. It wasn't a visit prompted by any official duty. Rather, it was his own curiosity, his desire to understand. The clinic was small, but filled with warmth and compassion. He spoke with the staff, listened to the patients, and saw firsthand the challenges they faced in accessing basic health care. It was here, among the women whose stories mirrored the ones Jamila had shared, that he began to understand the real stakes. A few weeks later, Judge Richardson called Jamila. His voice, usually firm, had a note of humility when he spoke. "Jamila, I've been thinking a lot about everything. About the fine, about the town hall, about what you're fighting for. I made a mistake," he admitted, "and I want to make it right." In the days that followed, Richardson took the unusual step of publicly reconsidering his decision. He issued a statement acknowledging that while Jamila's protest had broken the law, it was an expression of her deeply held convictions, a conviction he now respected. He announced that the fine would be reversed, and in its place, he would host a public forum on reproductive rights, inviting community leaders and activists to join in the conversation. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a beginning, a new chapter where understanding, dialogue, and mutual respect had taken root. Jamila's fight had never been just about one protest or one fine. It had always been about creating space for these difficult conversations, where people could listen and grow. For Jamila and Judge Richardson, their paths had crossed in a way that neither had anticipated, but they had both walked away from it changed.